There is a balm in Gilead to make the wounded whole. There is a balm in Gilead to heal the sin-sick soul. Sometimes I feel discouraged, think all my works in vain. But then the Holy Spirit revives my soul again. There is a balm in Gilead to make the wounded whole. There is a balm in Gilead to heal, to heal, to heal, to heal, to heal and make us whole. The healing balm that is with us today begins indeed with a spirit of deep gratitude. I am very grateful to be with you and want to thank Director Sarah Ward in Ohio Interfaith Power and Light, OSU, all of the different sponsors, President Rundell and MTSO, to Dr. Zimmerman, to all the different scholars who are here, to Ellen Postman, who came in as a friend, to Alicia for the invitation to come and be a part of these conversations. I am very grateful to you for the healing balm that is already in your soul this morning, that you have actually had the courage to come and join us again in these important conversations, more important now than ever before. If you, like me, woke up this morning to the news of yet another shooting, this one in Washington State, you know how deeply important it is for us to be in centering grace and to be pouring out prayers of hope and healing even in this time and in this land. As environmentalists, we have a particular challenge that our prayers are not only for the healing of the planet, but also for the healing of our nation in this particular time. Just a few weeks ago, it is so important now to recognize that over the past just few days, we have to now lift up in prayer not only the name of Sister Gonzalez as an ancestor and angel with us, but also of a 13-year-old boy unarmed who was shot by police, Tyree King, and Terrence Crutcher, and Keith Scott. These ancestors who are now with us, working from a heavenly place, justice in their own way, join us now asking some difficult questions. How do we embody love and earth justice in this time? My comments today are going to be a bit of a framework for our day ahead in conversation as we think about the importance of story, as we think about the importance of healing grace and how we and ourselves can be balms in this particular time in which we are called. In the tradition of Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. and Ella Baker, I am really excited to be here to represent the tradition of Black intellectual thought, African American religious history, and especially African American environmental religious history, or AIR. AIR, particularly appropriate when we think about the death of Eric Gardner, another victim, another unarmed Black man shot down by police. And when we think about that particular story, we recognize that it wasn't just the illegal chokehold and the impact of that on his body, but the fact that he had asthma and lived in Staten Island. The question for an environmental African American religious historian then becomes, was air quality an issue in that case of environmental injustice? When we think about the African American religious history, we actually have to engage the reality that it has not always been the case that this particular group, this community of color, has been invited into being a part of the environmental movement. There are some, believe it or not, who actually don't believe that African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans have been a part of the environmental movement. Many are not members of the board of the original group of the Sierra Club or the Audubon Society. In fact, diversity has been a challenge for many, many different environmental groups at their foundation and at the core, which is one of the reasons it's so exciting now that Ohio Interfaith, Power and Light, and many others are looking at diversity seriously. The intersectionality of justice issues means now that more than ever, we as keepers of the earth-keeping justice workers, must engage more deeply than ever the other justice issues. There are many scholars, Dorsetty E. Taylor, sociologist, geologist Florence Margai, who will suggest that this means that an entire new paradigm of doing environmentalism has to be developed. Many of you here are already engaged in this work and recognizing that an environmental justice paradigm is actually different than the original paradigms of the environmental movement at large. It actually does take seriously race, class, gender analysis. It takes seriously the voices of people who are quote unquote living on the margins. It takes seriously the challenge of environmental groups and boards and committees that many of us serve on to actually ask the question, who's not at the table? So in the work that I do with Jennifer Harvey, scholar at Drake University, who's also a Christian ethicist, I have to actually mind my P's and Q's here because I have a colleague in ethics who's going to keep me sharp on what I say in the field. So thank you all for helping me to stay accountable. Jennifer Harvey and I work in this really hard and difficult time around racial justice. And one of the things that Dr. Harvey and I have come to is that if ever we're in a committee or a summit or a board and there are people of color not at the table, or there's one person of color at the table, it's likely that no matter how brilliant our ideas are, they will not be enough. They will not be enough to actually heal. Even as powerful and as educated and as practical and as deeply theoretical as our conversations are at that table, if there are people missing at that table who belong to communities where environmental racism is a fact of life every day, then our work is not finished. The challenge before us then is to how to engage these justice issues all together. And today, how do you find rest in this very important and often taxing work? Being a spiritual director, I often find refuge in the practice and contemplative practice of prayer and journaling, but I also find a lot of refuge in storytelling and story sharing. In fact, this particular practice of storytelling and story sharing invites me to listen more deeply. If you, like me, have ever tried meditation, Buddhist meditation or Christian meditation, you know that for the first 2 minutes of silence in which you have committed yourself to a full hour of meditation can be agonizing. You hear your stomach growl. You know you need chocolate. You cannot sit in that place without checking your cell phone every other second. The 2 minutes of actually coming into a groundedness and peace can be difficult. But once you get through that first 2 minutes of meditation, one can recognize a deeper awareness. We are all one. The earth sings through your heart. Violence is sin. The earth is barely breathing. I can't breathe. Who knew that the Black Lives Matters movement actually has been a partner in ecological justice for a long time? As it turns out, the very same environmental justice paradigm that Black Lives Matters has actually been speaking to and acknowledging is the same paradigm that we also have been speaking to and acknowledging. In a similar way, in the same way that protesters all over Charlotte and Tulsa and Columbus have been gathering to speak truth to power, is the same way, in a sense, that we gather today. We begin today with a different entree, sharing story. There are 3 questions as a teacher that I'll put before you that we're going to move through today. And that's an invitation to reflect on why you came into this work in the first place. It could have been a childhood experience, a communion with nature, yourself. It could be like Alice Walker, the family dynamics in your home were so complicated that you actually found refuge with trees. The second question to invite yourself to reflect upon today is, what am I doing now in terms of the intersections of justice issues alive in this time? And the third question is how you might engage listening as an act of justice today. My mother's garden bloomed full of flowers most of the year. A native of Mississippi and the seventh child of 12, her own mother, Bessie Helen Wells, was a teacher and a farmer's daughter. Alexander Spears, my great-grandfather, believed in communing with the earth. That is why all 7 of his daughters and sons that he and my great-grandmother, Martha Spears, had, Bessie Helen Wells was expected to know how to feed hogs, raise chickens, and grow grain. She was given what I now call an agricultural epistemology, as spiritual orientation. She was not only taught to feed, raise, and grow, but to nurture, love, and respect every aspect of the earth. I am told stories of how my grandmother learned to read. Some say she practiced on almost everybody she knew. And when they grew tired and impatient, she withdrew to farm. I imagine her, book in hand, reading out loud to chickens and practicing her pronunciation in the ears of horses. It is no wonder that when I came along as a child, it was normal for my own mother, Naomi, to teach me that the best way to grow plants was to sing to them. Sing? I would always ask. Yes, sing. My mother would say, and then she would show me how to hum and pray with a flower. Receiving drink with the flower from a watering can. Perhaps the greatest song I have ever heard was a song sung in the garden, a spiritual experience I have of singing an African-American spiritual as I watered the flower beds in my mother's gardens and feeling this divine ancestral presence all around me, floating freely in the divine tones of music coming from deep within my own soul. I danced from waterbed to waterbed, admiring and singing the spirituals and sacred slave songs. I had learned them in church. Gazing at bees already humming at my mother's roses, I noticed that with everything that was going on, we all seemed to be singing the same song. Tell, O Pharaoh, let all beings go. Even the color of the roses seemed to add a melodic tone. Listening is a core part of singing. I learned this very, very early. And the louder I listened, the louder the music grew. It was May in Colorado. And each year as summer blooms, that song rises most high in my mother's gardens when the roses bloom through the branches of aspen trees. Now, honoring this growth process, me and my mother were amazed at these kinds of images. A rose, a tree, an aspen tree with roots, so different in their being and in their origins. How is it possible that they could actually sing together, reach to the same sky together? My earth connection really does begin with this kind of sitting with difference. Sitting with this amazing way of seeing the earth through a particular kind of lens. In the songs that you have heard already, you may have heard the slave's cry against oppression. In the songs you have already heard, you may have heard the deep communion of African and African American peoples to the earth, suggesting that that little myth that African Americans have not been a part of the environmental movement is completely wrong. What assumptions that means for us as environmental scholars and activists and teachers and artists, that in fact the paradigm that we may have been exposed to very early about how to bring diversity to the table in one or two chairs is actually not going to help us. In fact, the entire table has to be restructured. The whole conversation that we often have is based on a kind of colonial frame. What does it mean then to seriously consider intersectionality and the joining of all of these justice issues? It means that we have to take the breath of the earth and the breath of Eric Gardner seriously. It means that the same ancestors that are with us today, Gonzalez, King Jr., Ella Baker, Harriet Tubman, that the same power of the voice of Frederick Douglass are voices that we have to be open to in environmental justice work. One of the gifts of being from Colorado is to recognize that the same kind of environmental knowledge and epistemology that many of my ancestors came to was actually framed basically by the practice of slavery and the earth in the South, which was much more rich than the earth in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. As a scholar, then, it becomes very interesting to me to ask about eco-memory. What kind of agricultural memory did my ancestors have within them, and what was actually able to be transferred to the same space in Denver, Colorado? Even though Deerfield, Colorado, as a Black settlement only lasted about 2.5 years, my grandparents, along with other African American families, made a strong effort to allow the community that was being built there to last. They moved to Denver, Colorado, and like many millions of people in one of the greatest migrations in the history of the United States of America, the Great Migration, they made and communed and partnered with the earth differently. Recognizing that kind of history, that kind of story, is a part of our work in listening today. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm so grateful for the love and hospitality that comes out of Ohio. I mean, this is really great. This is some wonderful people. I'm so grateful. Thank you. Giving a glass of water to a preacher is always a blessing. So you will definitely be blessed. I want to share a little bit, too, today about the reality of the moment that we're in. Story has a really powerful way of healing. And coming to a place of being able to listen to other people's stories and listen to our own stories sometimes can actually be more difficult. If you've ever gone through any trauma in your own life, or you've just been, or you have also been impacted by the psychological damage of watching all of these police shootings repeatedly, seemingly week after week, sometimes day after day, If you have, with me, also gotten to a place within your own self where you're recognizing that it actually takes work, psychological and spiritual and emotional work, to hear and confront and allow for that story to be, then you'll also hopefully be helped with these kinds of steps of hearing and listening today. The steps that I'd like to outline come from an eco-womanist perspective and methodology. Eco-womanism is an approach to environmental justice that really centers the voices of African and African American women. Some of the research unfolds the kind of methodology and the practice, the connection with theory and practice that comes out of the Green Belt movement, out of the work of Wangari Maathai, out of the eco-literature of Alice Walker, out of the theological perspective of Dolores Williams and Emily Towns. But actually also embedded in this kind of way of being womanist, or way of thinking eco-womanist, is a really important method to always begin with experience. So the first step is to honor experience. Going back to the first question, how did you come to this work of environmental justice in the first place? Honoring that experience, no matter how complex that experience actually may have been. When we, as thinkers in justice work and all of the things that we're moving through right now, when we consider all of the history that puts us in this particular moment, many call this moment a kind of trauma-filled moment. We actually do have to be attentive to the history that's gotten us here. So in the case of racial justice, we do have to consider the legacy of white supremacy and the legacy of slavery in this country. Now, I find this particularly important for environmentalists because of the fact that the land was worked by descendants and slaves. How does a program look differently if we consider seriously the history of how racial justice has always been a part of the environmental justice movement? When we think about that kind of land history, when we think about Native Americans, when we even ask ourselves what part of the land that we work or advocate for, what part of that land was actually colonized, who was here first, telling that story in our mission statement, telling that story as a part of our programming is one way of practicing what I like to call ecological reparations. So honoring experience, honoring story is kind of the first step of what we would call an eco-womanist methodology. Reflecting on that experience is the second step. What would it mean then to widen the table or to take apart the table and build something new for others, for all of us to actually be in the conversation, reflecting on the experience, what's happened historically, and then making a decision to be different. Sometimes that reflection is helped by a third step, and that third step is actually taking seriously race, class, gender analysis and other forms of analysis. Now, I know if you're like me, you know what you know, and you know it well. But as it turns out, there are other people who can help us think. There are other disciplines that we actually have to open our hearts and our minds to. Being in this kind of interdisciplinary conversation then in itself as a kind of third step brings new life to our own story and allows us to share and deepen in being able to hear each other's stories and our own stories. The fourth step is actually really looking and examining these particular traditions, sometimes religious traditions from which we come. In eco-womanist thought and in African American religious environmental history, one of the things that becomes important is to recognize the religious pluralism that's a part of the entire religious practices around the African diaspora. It is actually not enough to actually just have African American Christian theologians or ethicists at the table. The African diaspora is not all Christian. There are Black Buddhists and Black Jews, and there are a number of African indigenous religious traditions. So by interrogating those kinds of religious traditions, we actually have to come up with the reality that a kind of interfaith and interfaith dialogue and sometimes interreligious dialogue is imperative for the way that we're doing environmental justice work. The fifth and sixth step of the eco-womanist method that are helpful, I think, in learning how to share a story, but then also how to listen to story, include the fact that we eventually move to being in conversation with each other. So the kind of transformation that's actually available when we consider that someone else's faith story or someone else's earth story or eco story may actually impact our own earth story differently. So such is the case that if we were to place on the screen, and I did not do this today because things are so heavy, if we were to place images of lynchings in America on the screen, and then we were to see images of Tyree King and others, my experience to those images might be different than yours, but there may be a deep empathy and compassion that immediately grows in your heart. That kind of compassion is a necessary tool for earthkeeping. It actually provides a new ground, a new soil in the base of your own heart and methodology, no matter how scientific you are, for a deep seeing that all are one. As we turn to the kind of sixth step and seventh step, the sixth step is really sharing dialogue and being in conversation, which hopefully we'll be able to do today over the course of the day, being able to talk to each other about the impact of someone else's earth story onto you and your own earth story, sometimes onto yourself. So I'm finally, believe it or not, getting of age where I can see myself at 20 and 21 and 22, sometimes in the eyes and the light of my students. And I thought a lot differently about my life at that age. I also thought a lot differently about the planet at that age than I do now. Sometimes being in conversation with yourself about your own eco-justice frame and how that's shifted over time, particularly of those of you who have lived through the civil rights movement or been activists and now are seeing the same kinds of images. It's a good invitation to ask ourselves the question, what does environmental justice actually look like now? Finally, taking action is the seventh step of an eco-womanist method. And that taking action can take place in a number of ways. Today, because we are in this session together and in this sharing of story together, I am going to invite you to consider that listening and being fully present is an act of justice. That listening and being fully present is an act of justice. That listening, not doing, not fundraising, not always, but that listening and being fully present is an act of justice. Ecological reparations is the challenge that we are invited to enter into today. It constructs a reparative framework that recognizes links between inequalities, the reality of globalization, the push for justice, and the urgency of climate change. It recognizes that while nature is not concerned with the politics of environmental policy, the reality is that the mainstream environmentalism often masks its implicit bias against communities of color. It recognizes that even while we are trying to promote the earth, that we are sometimes hindering ourselves from promoting true sustainability, true relationship. Robin Morris Collin and Robert Collin write an extraordinary essay in a book edited by Robert Bullard in which they actually talk a little bit more deeply about ecological reparations and the kind of work that we'll be doing today. And they say, quote, "Racism is real and has consequences on the environment. And in an age of police brutality against brown and black men and women, eco-womanism helps point out that what we are witnessing with this rise in violence and what we are witnessing in the Black Lives Matter movement is actually trying to shed light on the rise in the anxiety around economics, around changing racial demographics, and around power." Collins and Collins explain this, saying environmentalism makes an unconscious racism, mask an unconscious racism that threatens to replicate racist outcomes even without conscious intent. From an eco-womanist perspective, this truth can be explained as fear plus white supremacy equals racial and ecological violence. I was recently at a conference in which Emily Towns was speaking on race, Ferguson, and democracy in 2015 and last year. And there was a question in the audience by a colleague, Dan Spencer, who works, of course, in this field as well. And he just seemed to reflect, he's a white, male, out gay, teacher and professor and scholar in environmental ethics, and he just seemed to be reflecting on his own experience as a teacher in the classroom. And he just said, it just seems like so many people are so anxious about their own bills and how they're going to make it, and so many people are still recovering from the recession. And he says, the more I recognize this, it seems like the more I watch the news, the more black people are being shot and killed. Is there a correlation? Is there a correlation? Valerie Bridgman, in a conversation yesterday, left me with an eerie image. That the blood shed into the earth and the soil from every shooting and every act of violence from this place and all over the globe, that every Syrian refugee, that everyone who has not made it, that blood covers the soil of the earth. That blood is also life, ashe. It is energy, still, and life force. And that this awkward moment, as difficult as it is, this life force has to be the light to carry us forward. That the blood of the earth is not just nature, and that we are not just humans, but that we are nature, that the earth is us, and that we are the earth. Healing earth means healing us. There is a balm in Gilead to make the wounded whole. There is a balm in Gilead to heal, to heal, to heal, to to heal.